My name is Amber Huff. I'm an anthropologist and political ecologist based at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. Just one note, the critical databasing that was mentioned that I've been part of, that's actually like a huge amount of work on the part of my colleague, postdoc Linda Papagallo. So just want to clarify that and give credit where due. But so thank you so much for the introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about nature. Specifically, I want to explore a bit around the evolution of what we call the repair mode in environmental intervention through the lens specifically of remaking nature and using I want to use the notions of fiction, friction, and fragmentation as kind of three coordinates for seeing or rethinking how we're seeing and thinking about nature at the current global juncture, whatever we mean by that. So I think, I'd like to start with just a quick reflection on, what we're talking about when we're talking about nature. Cultural theorist Raymond Williams once said that when we're dealing with complicated ideas, what matters more than finding one proper meaning, one specific definition that we can agree on, is to open up to exploring the complexity of meanings and contestation around those ideas. And nature is one of these complicated ideas, to say the least. And I think we probably, all of us in the room, recognize that. Like a lot of complicated ideas, it's distracting, impossible, if not arguably irrelevant, to attempt any sort of concise definition of what we mean when we invoke the term. It's highly abstract, but also holds many contrasting meanings and values. I think this abstraction and this multiplicity makes nature a domain of ideas, knowledge, and politics that's particularly prone to mythologizing. Ideas about what nature is and where people figure in evolve also as paradigm shift. But at the same time, ideas hold on. They travel in time. They travel through disciplinary knowledge, institutions, popular cultures. They're inherited as myths, even when evidence to the contrary would indicate that we should reject certain ideas. They become received wisdoms. They become internalized as unspoken truths. So just to tell you a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from with this talk, this is an exploration. I don't have any answers, not definitive ones, just more questions, really. My research straddles three key areas that I think are related to understanding the politics of nature in the repair mode. These include engagement with environmental humanities and science and technology studies. I am coordinator and have been since 2021 of the Center for Future Natures at the University of Sussex. And we've done a lot of work exploring the phenomenology of life in the Anthropocene. What does life look like and feel like, more importantly, in this extended crisis moment that we find ourselves in? How do different forms of knowledge and knowing shape these perceptions and the actions that flow from them? Where do we see ourselves in relation to our environments? And what politics does this create? How can we imagine and create better futures through learning new ways of living and relating to each other in the present? And the second area that comes into the content of this talk is focused on really political economy and the high-level politics of global sustainability. So aspects of my research have focused in on the big shifts that we've seen in recent decades around how nature is framed and how technologies and techniques of environmental governance in the repair mode filter into popular culture and shape movements for change. And the third area that comes into this is really kind of where I put on my, anthropologist hat. This delves deeply into contextual dynamics through which these high-level politics that I mentioned before interact in landscape context with people's lives and livelihoods, histories of situated struggle for environmental justice, for creating new spaces and forms of positive change from below, but also spaces in which repair and restoration are being enacted on the ground. So working in the context of projects and initiatives, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. I've done research, for example, with Mikoko Pamoja, which was the first blue forest mangrove carbon forestry project, and an early adopter of labeled nature-based solutions, and it developed really pioneering methods for both social engagement and mangrove propagation and tree planting in coastal carbon forestry. So this work was done in southern Kenya. I've also researched biodiversity offsetting associated with the Rio Tinto QMM ilmenite mine in Madagascar, a place where I've done work for nearly 20 years, which makes me feel very experienced, let's say. And yeah, looking at the ways that biodiversity offsetting as part of a broader spatial intervention strategy that wasn't just limited to the mine site, but actually had effects on the ways that territories were imagined and governed throughout the Anusi region in southeastern Madagascar. Yeah, I forget what the first part of that sentence was, but anyway, so really a really transformative project here with forms of compensatory biodiversity offsetting at their center. And then my current project, which I am absolutely in love with, is called the Repair Project, and this is an ongoing, extremely messy transdisciplinary research project focusing on Southern African rangelands, nature-based solutions, and communal livestock farming. So just to contextualize the talk a little bit, and you know, just to kind of frame things in terms of the repair mode, I want to take a trip back in time a little bit by about 6 years. So, you know, in early December of 2020, many of us might remember some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. And this was just on the heels of COVID lockdowns. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres began an address at Columbia University in the United States with a eulogy for nature. His message could basically be summarized with a brief and distressing claim, and I quote, "To put it simply, the state of the planet is broken." However, there was good news. Of course, the solution was just in reach. Just one easy hack, I guess. Aligning financial assets with the goal of net zero today, he assured us in the speech, would repair the broken world, make peace with nature, and avert future climate impacts and global financial risks. And this, we were promised, would ensure that people can one day in the future enjoy better health, the full respect of human rights, and live with dignity on a healthy planet. So this speech came just a few days shy of the 5th anniversary of the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. And it came in the lead up not only to 2 major COP meetings on climate and biodiversity planned for 2021 and 2022, but also coincided with the 2021 launch of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. It really set the scene discursively and at that high level to promote a massively scaled up approach to international action that was meant to, quote, flick the green switch on global economic recovery, to end humanity's war on nature, to fix a broken planet. So even 6 years on, I like to revisit this speech. I think it's very indicative. I think it bundles together in an exemplary way the constellation of these big picture stories and tropes that are very powerful and really show this dynamic in high level framings of crisis, nature, and what I like to call like feasible solutions. That are associated with this crucial shift in the dominant international conservation paradigm that's been enacted roughly over the past 30 years. And this is something that I and colleagues in political ecology have discussed in terms of accumulation by restoration and the broader shift to an environmental repair mode of production. In the repair mode, of course, nature becomes a site of value production. Nature has always been a site of value production, right? But not only for extraction and industrial production, but also through the technologies and techniques of restoration and repair. So we have a dual pathway of accumulation formed, in many ways responding to the financial crises of the 2000s, excuse me, crises of the financial crises of 2000s and particularly 2008. Where there was widespread perception that we needed new markets, but we were experiencing a situation where we had reached and breached the limits of natural nature. So a crucial problem in the way that nature is remade through big stories of crisis, brokenness, redemption in the repair mode is that it's constructed as something out there. It's an aspect of the world that's distinct from society, apart from ourselves, but can be isolated, pacified, measured, extracted, priced, and traded in specific ways to satisfy the endless desires of selfish rational man. And this is the selfish rational man we have to deal with all the time, right? The one that's imagined by neoclassical economics. But, we go beyond humanity in this case, and we're talking about nature economicus, not just homo economicus, a one-dimensional, rationalized aggregate nature. It's a very powerful yet very imaginative ecology, a global ecology of data points, managers, bureaucrats, finance, and actuaries. But it's a myth. It's an abstraction. It's a fantasy. And it can only ever really exist in boardrooms and balance sheets. But at the same time, it has really profound consequences for our life and work. So it's not just an abstraction in the sense that it's separate from some concrete reality. It's an abstraction in the sense that it's a myth that shapes reality. So, as theorists have noted for many, many, many years, capital's enclosures, whether we're talking about ideas or space, they're always incomplete. They're always contested. So, we can think about this global production of, or this production of globalized nature, and how it's important, and how it's profoundly shaping a really dynamic terrain of intervention. But we also need to be conscious of the fact that the stories change, the stories shift when we step away from the planetary and the global framings, and we take a finer grained look at the natures that are existing and circulating at different scales. So digging down, just as one finds distinct national political cultures, we also see distinct national natures, what we might call national natures. Historically shaped narratives of what nature is, who it's for, what problems exist, who caused them, and who's entitled to identify and act to create solutions. So, I think Madagascar is a very good example because it's a country where a strong national crisis narrative is reproduced over and over again. We see this happening since really the pre-colonial period, which explains, basically posits that the island was once covered in these like lush forests, and that subsequent to human arrival on Madagascar, deforestation and habitat loss has been engendered by poverty, skewed economic rationalities, high birth rates, et cetera, among direct users of the forest resources, leading to their depletion. And a key element of this national narrative is that Malagasy people who depend on these resources are often represented in policy and historical documents in terms evoking the imagery of invasive species. In policy and global media, this imagery is of this like essentialized destructive rurality is used to imply transgression against a greater good and advance conservation policies historically that have been quite violent, but also as we're increasingly seeing land policies and development policies to bring in international investment. Hello. Similarly, but very differently, in South Africa, where we're also working, particularly on rangelands, generations of policies and interventions have sought to limit the mobility of pastoralists and their herds and prevent an inevitable tragedy of the commons. This has happened by controlling livestock numbers, and this is based on ideas of equilibrium, carrying capacity, assumptions about the impact of herbivores on plant succession, many other ideas that were inherited from European agronomy and ecology. In the early 20th century, this led to formulations like optimal sustainable yield within livestock farming systems, involving prescriptions for privatization, fenced camps, and conservative stocking rates that were very supportive of commercial livestock farming, but very negligent toward the reality of communal livestock farming, which is incredibly important in these landscapes. These ideas have become part of South Africa's national nature narrative. And it's been institutionalized in agricultural policy, and it's provided a standard by which communally governed rangelands have been frequently misjudged as spaces that have been described as problems without solutions, overstocked, inefficiently used, and ultimately degraded. So this is reinventing again and again this tragedy of the commons narrative. So this brings in our current project, Repair, which is a really dynamic project involving in-depth transdisciplinary research. It involves social sciences of multiple backgrounds, so anthropologists, geographers, sociologists, people in critical agrarian studies, grassland ecologists, grass taxonomists, cartographers, and now we brought in some people who deal with remote sensing and Earth observation data. We're looking at diverse social and ecological settings across the SADC region. So we're doing intensive research in both KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape provinces of South Africa. And we're doing intensive research in the Atsimu-Andrefana region of Madagascar. But then we're also bringing in case studies and examples from ongoing research throughout the SADC region to really ask questions about whether contextual approaches to nature-based solutions involving models like herding for health, build on one health approaches, can build resilience and do all these things that they promise to do. But also, this is an incredible kind of laboratory for asking questions about transformations around ideas of nature, values associated with it, how these are implemented, contested, negotiated in place in the repair mode. So why rangelands? Like they're having a big moment, actually. So this is the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. Yes. Rangelands are actually the most extensive type of land cover on the earth. They include things like open canopy grasslands, shrublands, savanna, wetlands, tundra, desert. These are the places that are suitable for extensive grazing of livestock and wildlife, because they're not suitable for intensive cropping or for forests. They're very complex ecological systems. They're undergoing a rebranding in kind of international policy as natural carbon sinks, not for carbon forestry, but for soil carbon projects, which are themselves contested and evolving, and really, we're seeing that as an active space of development of new methods for carbon accounting and carbon innovation. But they also face unique diversity. Like when we're talking about rangelands, we're talking about, wetter sort of mesic landscapes, but we're also talking about drylands, places that are facing extreme drought, like the landscapes in southwestern Madagascar where we're studying. And like also rangelands are just very historically misunderstood. Common understandings that are reflected in policy and scholarship around rangelands really do tend to reflect quite a lot of biases. And these aren't just biases and misunderstandings of ecology. These are biases against communal livestock farming, extensive livestock production, and misunderstanding of people's relationships to landscape. There's a tendency in some places, including Madagascar, to think of rangelands as simply degraded forests that are, places that need to be filled with tree plantations to make them productive of carbon, to make them generate these sorts of ideal aspects of nature that are indicative of the repair mode. We're partnering in this project with a really dynamic social enterprise called Meet Naturally Africa. We're working in landscapes in South Africa in particular, where they have active implementations underway. And this is a very exciting collaboration. Meet Naturally's activities fall into this category of nature-based solutions. This is a model, I'm sure we've all heard of it. Some of us do intensive research on it, I'm sure. But this is a model of intervention that's actively bringing about new natures of the repair mode, and bringing in new landscapes and resources and new spaces of investment for finance, particularly climate finance. And rangelands are a frontier for nature-based solutions right now, an evolving one. So what's a nature-based solution look like? Well, at the high level, it looks a lot like everything and nothing. It looks a lot like this model here, this picture here. And at best, it refers to this ideal type of project that integrates a variety of existing ecosystem-based approaches, and technical bureaucratic practices, particularly related to carbon value chain creation, to kind of enact this vision that dates back to the earliest kind of green economy discourse, this idea of putting nature to work for global sustainability. But there's a big gap between like the tidy integrated model and what NBS might look like on the ground. So nature-based solutions, NBS, same thing. Problems and solutions are always highly context specific. And this creates challenges to something else that nature-based solutions promise, which is scalable and effective models. So it's really been quite hard to refine any sort of unified approach to technical intervention beyond a very kind of broad sweep aspirational framing of what nature-based solutions are. So, in the context of this project and our broader work, we view nature-based solutions projects as important spaces for understanding natures in the repair mode, and the evolution of the repair mode itself. And this includes attention to the sorts of contestations and negotiations that arise as these concrete situated ecologies of repair are being configured in these landscapes of intervention where we're working. So interventions, we often think of them as being external, outside, but they become enmeshed in landscape. They interact with context, with these, what we're talking about in terms of layered landscapes, layered histories of struggles against colonialism, apartheid, displacement, repatriation, interacting and intersecting with and changing and being changed by the situated governance systems that they're rubbing up against. These are places with very complex layered histories of land use, political struggle, socio-ecological relationality, and experience with big environmental changes and shifts, not just now, but in the past as well. And because of this, we found it very useful to think of these nature-based solutions intervention landscapes as places for really deep learning. We can see how, these things that are framed as global challenges unfold in place. We can see how forms of knowledge and hidden pathways, not to mention, different methodological opportunities might arise in these spaces, which are essentially spaces, and this is where I get talking about Anna Singh a little bit, spaces of world making and scale making. So we're looking at these intervention landscapes really as dynamic and frictional spaces of encounter. So to borrow Anna Singh's metaphor, if this high-level nature-based solutions idea is like, basically like a wheel spinning in the air, something that's very disconnected from the terrain of the earth that it seeks to describe, then these are the places where the rubber hits the road. This is the place where you're seeing complicated spaces coming together, spaces of encounter, spaces of friction, that are created through the movement of ideas, worldviews, knowledges, forms of authority, species of animals, plants, fungi, historical memories, visions of rural futures. And these are all rubbing together, getting to know each other, fighting with each other, creating heat and creating new layers in these landscapes. And so part of the repair project that we had to add on later is actually kind of an exploration of myths. So ideas are part of these frictional encounters as well. They move and circulate just like chickens and people, and cows and grass. And we we realized that if we're going to contextualize rangeland restoration, nature-based intervention, and kind of transformations of ideas of what nature is in context, then, context has to go beyond specific project settings, landscapes, and national policy frameworks, and even regional histories. It also requires that we consider how places and people and all these things get enmeshed in these broader understandings, knowledges, and norms that are often historically shaped and very persistent. So, so part of our project has now involved, rethinking what we think about nature, which is not a big at all. And so we're working with comic artist Tim Zacco, who I've worked with for a long time at the Center for Future Natures, to create illustrations that seek to capture the tropes and ideas that we think are part of these really powerful overarching myths and metaframings about nature. So I'm not going to go in depth on any of these, but I'm very proud of them. So I like to show them whenever I can, and just give you an idea of how we're using these. So of course, like, what we've called like the master myth is the tragedy of the commons. Coming from, game theory, which I think Tim captured really nicely here. It kind of makes me want to play. Another myth that we've taken on is the myth that carbon is carbon. That we can nature-based commodities in a way that is substitutable and exchangeable anywhere in the world based on calculations on a balance sheet without losing something. This is fundamentally a critique of real abstraction and carbon supremacy that we see characteristic of the repair mode. Really relevant for the topics of this symposium, this idea that healthy ecosystems are always green and lush and covered in trees. When we're talking about rangelands, particularly, the idea that fire is the enemy of rangelands is an extreme overgeneralization and a really powerful myth. And this is something that we were, I just got back from Madagascar a few days ago, actually, but this is something, it's like both of these ideas actually are really, really relevant right now, especially with the push for tree planting that we see at the national scale in Madagascar. As well as historical fire suppression policies that have often criminalized people for using fire in landscape management, which is absolutely necessary in a lot of contexts. And then, of course, like the classic classic myth that humans and livestock are bad for biodiversity, that you have to separate people and domesticated animals so that wildlife and wild plants and all of the beautiful things can thrive. It's a tragic myth, and rangelands really, really do justice at providing counter narratives to this myth and to all of these really. And so why myths? Why are they important? Breaking through these sorts of myths, and we've taken on many, many more myths. We actually have 10 that we're dealing with this year as part of our engagement with the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. Breaking through these myths helps us not only understand relationships between knowledge and politics in the repair mode, but it helps us break through the spectacle of global nature and see the messy reality of existence through clearer eyes. So this is one way that our critical and transdisciplinary approach in this project becomes really important. Looking through the myths, we can see things like pictured here in the photo, things like brush packing, terracing, the use of fire, and livestock grazing can all be considered existing solutions. So if nature-based solutions are new, like what's wrong with that framing? It feels really weird and off, right? But we can really see that in context if we kind of break through this idea of this separate, by default, degraded natural world that we've broken. We look at spaces of existing regeneration, recovery, and repair as a way of pushing back against and subverting the global politics that can be quite alienating and harmful. So we look to existing solutions in situated management systems. These can help control erosion, improve biomass, enhance habitat for biodiversity, improve water and sediment yield in rangelands. But again, this isn't scalable knowledge. These dynamics are extremely particular. Like the dynamics vary. What's useful varies across even one landscape, and it can be really hard to see through a top-down technical lens. So at the same time, this helps us see how elements of specific interventions, if it exists, and these can involve creating grazing associations, rangeland stewardship agreements, using value chains to incentivize local participation. These can all be really highly contested and carry unanticipated effects that can be detrimental both for landscapes and for the projects. Breaking through the myths also helps us question what we think we see when we see nature. So a good question is this, is this good? Does anybody know what that is? That's black wattle. It's terrible. It drinks up all the water. It's a major factor of like bush encroachment in rangelands in South Africa. It creates sterile terrain, and it grows really, really fast. But some people would look at this patch and say, oh, that's what the rest of it should look like. Trees are great. We need a tree, without thinking about what is the tree? What's the tree doing? Is this a place where trees are the best thing if we want to see, a lush, flourishing, biodiverse landscape? So, if nature-based solutions are going to ultimately be equitable and sustainable in rangelands, a critical lens like we're using in KwaZulu-Natal, and this is one of the oldest kind of that's looking at the fire in range on rangeland health. So this is what that's not been burned for maybe 50 years. I don't know. Yeah, but when you look at kind of the diversity of animals, plants, you look at the soil microbiome, it's quite sterile compared to what's around it. I just think it's a very interesting place to play. Yeah, likewise, when we look at things like this grazing area in the drylands of southwestern Madagascar, this is a grazing area in the Mahafali Plateau. But then if we dig down and say, well, what are we actually looking at in this landscape that's quite brown and dry, crispy? This is an incredibly drought-ravaged region, but this is also an incredibly biodiverse grazing area. So these things might seem paradoxical, but these sorts of landscapes, digging into them through ecological research, can help us to overcome expectations for what a biodiversity ecosystem looks like, challenge like the arboreal supremacy of tree planting regimes, and say, yes, tree planting is warranted sometimes and is beneficial. But also not, if we make everywhere a plantation, then what do we lose? We lose so much, because understanding how this landscape operates, and involving people and not people and geology, it really helps us understand how existing people and existing places are responding to climate change, because we're looking at a place that's experienced what some has been a 30-year drought, where you look forward to the cyclones because then the rain comes, which is a terrible prioritization to have to make. Also, getting back to the issue of fire, like this is also some examples of the sorts of biodiversity we've got. It's wild spiny aubergine. It's a prickly, dry-loving plant that's only found in this place, but it's everywhere. Also, raqueta, Malagasy prickly pear cactus, even though prickly pear cactus is originally from Mexico, which is a huge source of fodder for Malagasy zebu cattle, also a source of food for people, helps people get through periods of drought because it's holds a lot of water. By people, I mean people and their cows. It's relational. And also the use of fire to make things like raqueta accessible to is very important. But also to cause, like, in certain seasons, the green flush that creates delicious grass shoots for the cattle to eat that they love. So fire is demonized. Raketa have been historically demonized in Madagascar. Ended up being used politically as kind of weapons of the weak in this context. But you know, we can better see how, even though these things are demonized and at kind of the higher levels, they're intimately connected to management systems that create flourishing. And help us think critically about second basic. So in conclusion, you know, I just want to reflect again back to this politics of planetary nature. So from this eagle's eye standpoint, from the planetary view, you know, we're kind of like a pale blue sphere hanging in space. And, you know, if we see nature, if we see the Earth like that, it can make sense that there's, you know, only one humanity, only one story about nature, one science, one knowledge, one pathway, one consensus that all our futures hinge on. And, you know, this politics of crisis that is attached to this notion of the planetary, it works to frame policy responses and, you know, it helps define global challenges in ways that work for some, but it also works on us. It creates perceptual slippages between, you know, the lived world that we inhabit and virtual representations. So yeah, the model, the representation, it becomes easily confused for the inhabited territory. But the world isn't a globe, we know this, right? A globe is an idea, it's an abstraction itself, it's a simplification, it's all smooth. But the real world we live in has mountains and valleys and peaks and canyons and texture. And some of these textures are created by our human experiences as well. It has magnitudes of inequalities in wealth, in experience, in well-being. It's not a balance sheet. Yeah, so I think really breaking through this spectacle of planetary nature, you know, we can see, of course, like alternatives, you know, and using landscape approaches like we're using in repair and have used in other projects, I think can help us really dig in and see how, you know, things like in place struggles in Amadiba in the Wild Coast in South Africa are fundamentally challenging planetary politics and enclosures within South Africa. So where people have fought against and successfully defended land against mines for ilmenite, have fought against oil mining, have resisted biodiversity offsetting that cut across landscapes that people required access to, but have also effectively articulated, you know, a rooted, landscape-based alternative vision for development in South Africa that's been very inspiring. These methods can also help us open up to diverse experiences of nature. So thinking about landscapes as spaces of encounter, for example, it helps to force us to see that local isn't an isolated space. There is no like, you know, place where you just have like the local people and the local community. But these spaces are spaces of interaction. And working with natural scientists, for example, the people who also inhabit these landscapes and love these landscapes, helps us, you know, start to think in different conceptual languages as well as social scientists. So like at that micro level, we see really unexpected natures arise in interaction with natural sciences. So when I was in Madagascar, I was traveling and working with a grass taxonomist and with ecologists who see grasses and call them their special friends. And it's very, very beautiful. Because the way they talk about them embodies a relational view of nature that bridges all the forms of life that thrive there in these landscapes. And it, you know, and that holds this, you know, very intensely deep biogeographic history of landscape. And, you know, and grasses hold these in their shape and in their genes. And it's really, you know, quite a profound realization to be part of. And then, of course, there are natures, this can't eclipse the fact that there are natures that, despite massive changes, are being tightly held as symbols of the values that connect people to the land and create continuities between past, present, and future. So, yeah, sorry for the quality of this image, but this is from my field notebook. We were doing a participatory mapping exercise, and a little boy was sitting next to me, and we were passing my pen back and forth, making drawings. And he drew this, and I had no idea what it was. And I said, what is this? And he said, Raza. And I said, Raza, you can draw that? And Raza is the Malagasy word for ancestor. And I thought this was amazing because I'm like, oh, I've never seen somebody draw an ancestor. I didn't know that you could. But yeah, but this is, it's basically the top part is a sphere. The things that look like arms are branches of a plant. And then you have the roots that go into the tomb that's connected to the soil. So yeah, so these big changes also don't totally, don't eclipse and don't crowd out the values that people hold. So yeah, I'd just like to say, just to close, yeah, if we're going to survive, we need to embrace ways of knowing and ways that seek to help, that don't double down on a single model or a single solution nor one vision of the future, but instead work to break the stranglehold that these politics can have on us. The politics of globalized nature creates fractures and ruptures that widens the gap between us and the world that we're part of. And, the world isn't broken. We have to develop new ways of doing research, of living together, of collaborating that challenge us and cultivate spaces of noticing, open up space for discovery, foment debate and conflict because it's needed, and help us direct attention to the multiplicity of natures and how they can be sources of enchantment and inspiration really in a changed and changing world. So thank you.
Perfect. I was just gonna say, just don't be. I was gonna say that was, I didn't even have, I was like, she's gonna finish on time. I don't even have to give the 2-minute warning. Like, we're doing it. That's awesome. All right. So thank you so much for that really amazing food for thought. And now we have time to think about it together and discuss this a bit. So we have approximately half an hour that we can speak together about this topic, either through the form of questions, interventions, dialogue, facilitated. Dance. Does anybody want to dance? No? Okay. I mean, I'm up for it. We can dance. I do want to remind our participants online that they are welcome to either put a question in the chat, or if you would like me to open your microphone, you can indicate in the chat that you would like to ask a question, and then we will deal with that. Don't worry, everybody, I'll keep an eye on it. So from either online or in person, who would like to get the ball rolling? Show of hands. Maria, you go for it.
Yeah, I'm going back a little bit. I mean, the whole thing very, very inspirational and interesting presentation. So thank you for that. I'm thinking about this shift towards rangelands. Really interested in what do you see happening with nature as we go from this very forest-centric global nature to store carbon. And I followed also regenerative farmers and rangeland, that. And I know they are being discovering how to work with nature in a way, and it has been wrapped by this global policy in a way. And now they many of them buy into it as well as a hope for an income. So I'm just an additional income of carbon markets. So I'm just wondering, what do you see in this shift? What is the friction you see in the shift from forest, and will the forest remain there still as a myth, as a global environmental policy? And what happens as we bring cows and grasses into this global nature?
Respond to one by one, or did we?
I don't know. I mean,
Yes, so we can take it on lunch as well. Yeah, we can take it on lunch. We can have another symposium where we ask other people that. So the shift to rangelands. It's really interesting to me, and this is actually why, why I originally wanted to work with Meet Naturally and develop the proposal for this project. And this gets to the question of why I also wanted to work with Mikoko Pamoja, the Kenyan project that pioneered blue forest carbon. Because I am fascinated with the question of, and I think you asked this question in the beginning of like, and you were talking about this too, when you said when you look at the websites, when you look at the project documents, it just gets less and less clear of what's actually going on. So this gets to the question of, I want to know like literally how the repair economy is being made from the bottom up.
Yes.
And to do that, you need to understand how these new nature commodities are being, one, envisioned, but also produced in context.
Yes.
And that is something like you can do all you want to read about the, you know, the different like technical needs that go into project development, but you can't actually know how that's going on and how those are like being innovated basically in context unless you go to the places and you hang out in projects where that innovation is having to happen. So the context of Mikoko Pamoja, you had, you know, the desire to create a project to facilitate ongoing research and to deliver some social benefits, but you had a national REDD+ strategy that didn't recognize mangroves as forests. So you know, as basically, you know, they were having to wait for the notion of forest to be redefined in a way that would accommodate the mangroves. They also had to develop from scratch kind of methods for bringing the forests in to the voluntary carbon market. And the same sort of thing is happening on a much more massive scale when we're talking about rangelands, just because of their spatial extent on Earth and their diversity. So not only are you having to bring in like one new type of tree, you're having to bring in all sorts of types of landscapes under this manner of soil carbon generally, which itself, you know, has undergone, you know, differentiation because there are, you know, demands for removals and demands for reduction, and they're created in different ways with different technical needs, which we won't go into. But basically what we're seeing is, you know, a diversification you know, within global carbon markets at this moment. Then this is the moment that was basically enacted when kind of Mark Carney, who's now Canadian Prime Minister, but was then like Governor of the Bank of England, came up with his task force in, I think, 2021, that was like, we're going to scale up the voluntary carbon market to billions and billions. Not, I love Carl Sagan, but like that big plan. Yeah, so what they needed in order to do that level of scaling, or they, you know, what was needed in order to achieve that level of scaling was that massive amounts of land be brought under the carbon gaze. And there weren't enough forests to do that. So you had a push for afforestation, for figuring out how we deal with afforestation, because plantations are not forests. Yeah. But trees are trees if you count them right. And also for figuring out how but how these massive amounts of marginal land just sitting out there unused, vast empty landscapes, you know, degraded, you know, if you want to look, you know, at some of the framings, you know, by default, you know, how they can be brought in. But you need new methods, you need new standards for verifying projects, you need new sorts of carbon developers, and you have to have new approaches that can deliver tangible benefits to people, because everybody already knew at this time that they needed to look out for dispossession, for green grabbing, and for, you know, investor driven forms of exclusion. And this had already been building, and it was very widely known. So yeah, so this is part of the solution to that scaling up. But it's also resulting in differentiation in the sorts of carbon that exist in the world. So which is a fundamental challenge to the notion of carbon being effectively substitutable and fungible across any context. The question is, going forward, I think, you know, as carbon markets diversify, dimensions, which is happening. It's not just boutique and, you know, Walmart off the shelf forest carbon. It's so many carbons now. So what happens to that promise of global nature, of this balance sheet nature? You know, do things become less substitutable? Can we still buy offsets and apply them to our like factory in Sweden or Finland or the UK that come from a rangeland, you know, in South Africa, in the same way that we could get some more from a forest in Kenya. So yeah, these are really important questions, like, you know, just like fundamental things I think we need to figure out. And watch, because it's all, you know, a lot of it is all about how it's pitched, right? Marketed, branding. But yeah, sorry, that was long.
No, it's
Did I answer everything? Are forests still gonna stay? Yes, absolutely, forests are still gonna stay. It's like, you know, forest. But we've got to figure out new ways to make them, right?
All right, we're gonna go over to this side. We're gonna do 2 questions in a row, experiment.
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
first we'll do OC and then I can make some appear. You can make water. Oh, there you go, make it appear. So yeah, OC and then.
Thanks. Very interesting presentation. I like, yeah, you pictured it really well. The kind of the wheel running there, and then the fictional. I was thinking with the rangelands, when it's a huge areas. Currently, I don't know much of them, but anyways, and there's this huge has been this huge fetish on carbon this long time already, but that's kind of tied very much, I think, to forests especially and all that. Of course, the soil carbon is one thing, but with these large areas, like non-forest areas, has there been like discussion of this planet's reflexivity, this albedo, this that like when you have more solar rays reflecting, it's like a cooling, and then if it's darker spaces, it's because that's kind of the if we think carbon is just part of the whole kind of albedo stuff. Carbon is the that makes the greenhouse effect. So I think that could be an interesting like a thing to start talking about, because that's oftentimes in geoengineering stuff, and that's kind of delegitimized so strongly that it's not being discussed much even in critical science or society.
Yeah, I can say that I have not encountered that in the context of my work, but that's not saying that it's not happening. And I should actually ask around about that. Oh, sorry, too.
Yeah. Like I said, it was an experiment.
I'm just worried that you're gonna hit this.
Oh my God, I'm so nice. If you want to continue answering, you'll still get to ask the next question, okay?
No, I really don't have an answer, but I am happy to discuss that down the line, because now I'm gonna fall down that rabbit hole.
I'll stand up and ask the question. Because we are sitting in a school of economics, I want to ask about the climate compensation schemes or carbon compensation schemes that you seem to be very negative about. When I started my research in the late 70s in West Africa, and then in the early 80s in North Africa, there was very much discussion about afforestation and about tree planting as a solution to erosion and desertification and such problems. But there was very little money flowing from north to south. So when I confronted it myself, the lack of funding for many projects tree planting projects that I thought would have been very useful. But today you have this opportunity of using climate compensation schemes with all the negative aspects also to consider. But aren't there any useful positive sides of this possibility of using funds for tree planting and restoration?
Yeah, I'm not actually negative about incentivization. I think if people are, I mean, this is a big thing about these sorts of projects, is it's very easy to have a situation where you have much more labor needed to carry out these projects than can be compensated by wages. So I think if people are happy with an existing incentive scheme, and, you know, have the choice to choose whether or not they want to participate in a project. I think functional incentive schemes are very important. You know, the problem comes in when they can't even offset like the opportunity costs of participation. And also when the project creates new costs and new risks. So saying like, oh, well, we've created a value chain for meat, or we've created a value chain for carbon, or we've created a value chain for this or that, or we've created, you know, even like market opportunities for the women's group, or, you know, any of these things. If that can't effectively buffer people in a situation that your project has created, then you're creating the forms of risk that, you know, you're ostensibly hoping to not exacerbate. They're just coming from a different source. The idea, I think also, like, you know, the idea that, you know, market-driven incentive schemes are necessary. There can't be other sorts of incentive schemes or other ways that people are compensated for their participation in these projects. I think that it's, I mean, it's, you know, I mean, it's definitely like a very accepted fact that there's just not enough money. So, you know, we have to, you know, we have to use value chains. But the idea that there's not enough money, I think, is quite ludicrous. I think there's not enough will to use the massive amounts of money, you know, that exist within financial markets, you know, in order to actually deal with like real problems that people are experiencing in restoration landscapes that actually do need intervention. So I think, you know, I mean, there's been lots of questions around kind of these debates during the IYRP year about climate finance and whether there should be a moratorium even on carbon markets in rangelands until, you know, incentive schemes can be, you know, guaranteed to be more equitable and less risky. You know, and carbon markets themselves are risky. So we think about, you know, we often hear this discourse of like, you know, it's the only way. We've got to, you know, configure this and make it happen and make it bigger. But they peaked in 2022, you know, and like we're not seeing the Carney vision like unfold in terms of the worth of these markets. So yeah, so I mean, just a little bit of reflection, not a direct answer, but yeah, it's complicated. But yeah, I'm not averse to the idea of incentives. I think it's incredibly important to compensate people for their work and not to enslave them in a carbon project or a tree planting project. I mean, if we're going to say we have equitable interventions, that's the basic, you know, fundamental thing we need to make sure of.
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to know more about these maybe their national governments, like how do they work with these kind of their nature initiatives? Like, did you find any like significant differences between them? Like, so do they emphasize, or is everyone kind of like investors or working with NGOs? Like in these 3 locations, South Africa, Kenya, and Madagascar, do you have some comparative site? It's just local ones, but on a national level.
Yeah, there are pretty stark national differences. We are in the middle of the repair project, and we haven't actually like fully analyzed done the national comparative policy, you know, kind of environment / vibe analysis across those countries. And then I would want to integrate it in with, you know, what I understand about Kenya, but they are very different. They are very different. So yeah, so in Kenya, when I was working with Mikoko Kamoja, there had just been like a massive wave of forest policy reforms in the prior decade. There had been the development of the mechanism of co-management agreements. There had been, I mean, and we're talking about very devolved government in this case. You know, the Kenya, except for the fact of the Kenya Forest Service, which is very, very powerful in this kind of sector. So you have that. So you have kind of like a quite authoritarian Forest Service, but then policy reforms that are meant to open up governance to forest dependent and forest adjacent communities, while maintaining a centralized kind of stranglehold ownership, state ownership of forests. So in Madagascar, likewise, you have like this de facto idea of state ownership of forests, but these sorts of things don't really affect rangelands as much. I'm not studying forests right now, but I have in the past in Madagascar. So, I mean, you have similarities across many, many countries in terms of the claims, like the domain, what is it, like public domain forest reality. But yeah, in Madagascar, you have a very, very different environmental policy history. You have, you know, I mean, in both of the places, in all three of the places, international environmental organizations are very powerful. And I would say have had important roles in shaping both policy and nature markets. But yeah, but the internal dynamics are different. What's similar across all is, you know, having gone through very rapid like legislative reforms in order to enable things like RED and carbon markets to operate. South Africa is a little bit different. We've got a national market that's developing. They're also, you know, in terms of the economy, it's quite different than Madagascar, for example. So, and the livestock economy is different too. So you have different policy frameworks, like supporting commercial livestock farming, and actually most agricultural policies, you know, like don't even consider communal livestock farming to be livestock farming. So they're just kind of left out. But you don't have that commercial sector in the same way in Madagascar, where you do have things like commercial abattoirs. They're highly controlled by like foreign companies, foreign investors. So you very, very much have like a governance state that's run by, you know, to a large extent investors, and a state that kind of goes along with it, but is also rather absent in many of the areas we work. Not absent, but kind of absent. So yeah, sorry if I can't answer your question in a systematic way, but yes is my answer.
Once again, we have two lined up. We have up here and then belay.
Linda wants to ask a question.
Well, Linda has to wait.
Say it in case you.
Yes, hi. I'm Grace Wong from Stockholm Resilience Center. And I wanted to, you know, you talk about myths and things like that, and we know how that impacts policy making. But those are also myths that's been around for like decades. And I wonder sometimes how that affects people that are, you know, practicing their livelihoods or their practices. I guess because policy affects change, ideas also impact change. And, you know, in your research, where do you see within this kind of, you know, populating ideas, how does that affect possibilities are in terms of this relief? I just wanted to hear a little bit of your experiences.
Take two?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know.
No, I think I was waving it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, then maybe we should let Linda ask her question.
Happy to be here. Second in a row.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thanks. Well, really, really powerful speech. Thank you, Amber. You have been inspired me with your work for a long time. It was more than powerful, it was like burning and liquid at the same time. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you about the kind of the knowledges that are related to the knowledge productions that are related to this kind of repair mode. First of all, I'm happy you talked about the rangelands to take us kind of away to kind of from the arboricentric logic and carbon and forest to a certain extent. But I think with the kind of repair mode, there are like frictions of certain scarcities and abundances related to knowledge production and technologies and social movements. And I think much of them they are of course attached to like broader discursive changes. I think you worked in South Africa with the science
plants must fall kind of movement, and then introduced this also to a lot of kind of ethnobotanical knowledge regimes, which is very interesting. And I think many kind of environmental humanities scholars have also argued that it's through this kind of really situated environmental ecological knowledges that can actually have the materiality to challenge some of the existing technocratic knowledge regime. Then I was just asking for your maybe reflection. How do you see the potentiality of this type of knowledges that are actually attached to the repair mode to challenge some of the existing or cemented kind of ways of knowing? That's just the ecological. I mean, it has influenced you, I saw, and it has influenced me. The type of relationality that comes with relating to these different natures. So you see there is some kind of potential.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, well, yeah. So I will start with your question, and then I'll move on to the myths question. Yeah. So the question. Okay. So yeah. So the question of like, is there hope? Like, so
This type of
exactly. Yeah. Qualified. Is there hope?
Yeah.
So yes. I mean, so like what we're seeing is, within the repair mode, I think, like these things are contested. Knowledge is contested all the way down and all the way back up. There's not, I mean, in some of my previous publication, like with Andrea Brock, on accumulation by restoration in the repair mode, we're describing certain tendencies, but we're only really describing one particular tendency, which we saw is particularly hegemonic because of its closeness to power, to financial capital, and things like that. What's missing from that analysis is the fact that, all the way down you have, you have this incompleteness in that project of kind of enclosing nature, through restoration, through one particular very narrow lens on what the problem is, who caused it, and what we need to do, not to fix it necessarily, because there are some people who outright reject restoration as a concept because ecology doesn't work that way. We're not going back. But yeah, so yeah, it's just it's quite messy, and quite exciting, I think. Yeah, and all of these yeah, I think all of these sorts of spaces that we're talking about at whatever kind of scale, we do need to be looking to kind of like these, alternative conceptualizations and of repair. So I talked a little bit about resistance in Amadiba, where you have notions of restoration, of conservation, of development that are distinctly different from kind of the national action plan being actively and successfully, effectively, but exhaustingly resisted. But these are rooted in struggles that are much older than, green economy discourses or repair discourses or landscape restoration or biodiversity offsetting or carbon projects. These are examples like Amadiba or like people in Ansutsu who've been highly affected by the biodiversity offsetting that Rio Tinto created. Like these cases show that, like, and this is relevant to thinking about hope too, because struggle doesn't end. It's something that gets renewed, and the nature of it might shift. But if you have kind of like an orientation toward these sorts of contestations that is rooted in struggle, you can, I think, find much more hope than looking toward them in a way that's looking for an endpoint at which you win, or like your side kind of takes over. Because in that situation, what you would be looking at, because of the nature of globalization, you would basically just be looking at something else that replaces, but is, probably equally reductive and problematic. But I think, noticing being sensitive to, you know, these sorts of contestations and also the differences across places. I think, yeah, like supporting movements engaged in struggle when we can, being attentive to the politics of knowledge. I mean, this all makes science better. It all makes us stronger together. It helps keep us, you know, grounded in the face of these politics. It's not soft questions that we're asking. You know, when we talk about, you know, engaged research, using arts, using all this stuff, it doesn't soften our science. It makes it more resilient and more rigorous in a lot of ways, because, you know, if we're not just speaking to each other at this point, we, like, as researchers, we need to be able to speak to each other as people. Yeah, I'm sorry, pondering answers. And the question on myths. So yeah, these myths have been around. That's why we're tackling the ones that we're tackling, is because these are old. They are, you know, sometimes older than we even realize, because some of them, like the tragedy of the commons, for example, has only even been given a name in the past, what, 75 years? So that was named by Garrett Hardin, but it was something that came together based on, you know, much deeper politics, longer term politics. So yeah, so this idea that, you know, mobility is the source of conflict, you know, and not resilience. That's another myth that we're taking on. This has old roots in sedentist bias in Europe and in colonial policies that dictated the number of roofs that villages had to have, and, you know, how people would get fined for being like itinerant or vagrant, or yeah, all these things. Yeah, they have deep roots. They go back, and that's why we take them on, because of their rootedness in history. They have traction that maybe ideas that are more novel propositions might not have, because they are taken for granted. They are taken as rules of thumb quite often. They are in policy. They are institutionalized already. And this is also one reason that we're not talking about debunking, because these ideas that we're taking on are already debunked. We're not going to do that again. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. But we're framing our work around rangeland myths, which is actually still ongoing. This is research. It's not just communications. We're framing our work around rangeland myths as an invitation for people, whether, you know, you're somebody who is like a member of a community of place that's involved in a project, or somebody who is part of the Stockholm Resilience Center, or, you know, an anthropologist, or anybody who has experience or has encountered these myths and is aware of that and wants to work through things, to come together in a space where we can rethink what we think we know. And so, you know, there has to be kind of a questioning spirit that comes with that. But you don't have to bring answers. What we're asking people to bring is their stories and their experiences and their understandings of kind of what happened, you know, in their encounters, or in a particular policy arena where they're very embedded. And so this is how we're kind of not only, you know, offering a big provocation, but collecting data actually, and bringing in counter narratives and stories that can help subvert the politics around these myths instead of just trying to debunk. So yeah, so there are actually lots of possibilities, and these, we're having basically online kind of discussions every month focused on a different myth, and these have been very generative spaces. Like our one on carbon, we did one that was on the myth that carbon is carbon a few weeks ago, and it was absolutely amazing. So we'll have, you know, a few speakers that just offer a few words to kind of like prime the conversation, but the idea is for them to have very different backgrounds. So we had like somebody involved in carbon development, carbon project development, along with a couple of very critical researchers. Actually one was a lawyer who has been involved in human rights cases around carbon projects. One was a researcher who, an ecologist who's very passionate about no, not carbon. And yeah, this was yeah, just a really incredible moment, that a sort of conversation that doesn't happen often enough. And so I think, you know, throughout the year, what we've seen is that we're having conversations that don't happen often enough because they're so polarizing. Like people are so invested in what their position is and in presenting the kind of brand that they need to present in order to maintain that system that they're part of, that we don't actually engage in the conflicted conversations that we need to be having. And I think this is something that also speaks to the fact that, like, you know, people like me, critical social scientists, people, you know, who you know, have very strong feelings and ethics and values around these big issues, you know, need to be working with and collaborating with people who think and do things very differently and have very, very different backgrounds and standpoints that they're coming from. And the way to broker those collaborations is to be absolutely open and have an agreement in place in the beginning that when these areas of tension around these things like these myths or particular practices or particular ideas, like when they come up in the project context, that you don't try to bury them and find a consensus, that you actually like try as best you can to really dig down and understand what's going on and why this is such a sensitive area. So yeah, sorry.